Welcome back to another Wednesday on the Pagan Perspective. I'm your Wednesday host, Yeka, and this week we are talking about sex, gender, and paganism. So I've been really excited for this topic and also really nervous because it's a big topic to cover and there's a lot of big emotions around it. So it's a multi-part topic from multiple people. The description is below if you want to go ahead and read it. But I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And the first one comes from Jack, who writes your thoughts on transgender people and the difference between a biosex and a mental sex. So this topic, this could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. When they say biosex, I assume biological sex, and mental sex, they might be talking about gender, or they might be talking about some of the neurological differences between the sexes. So I'm going to nerd out here for a little bit with you guys, and I'm not going to deal with sexuality at all. I'm just going to keep this to sex and gender. And also, before jumping in, I'm not going to go into me personally, just sort of talk about this on a general level, but I will just say if people are curious, I am a cisgendered female bisexual butch. If you want all my adjectives, that's what it is. So that's the perspective that I am coming from, and different people are going to come from different perspectives. So in terms of the difference between sex and gender, this is something that right now our culture is having a pretty big conversation about. It's something that the literature does not have consensus on the vocabulary, and in modern Western society, until rather recently, these two concepts were seen as the same, just different words to describe the same thing. It was maybe a little crass to call it sex instead of gender, because sex is something that dogs have, or that parts of a flower have, not humans. Humans have gender. But now there is a shift in the way that we are thinking about these concepts and the way that we're talking about them. So there's still a lot of back and forth on that. So I'm going to give you my understanding of these terms right now. And let's start with sex. So generally, sex is considered a biological thing. But it isn't quite as simple as to say, well, biologically you're female or you're male. Because being biologically female or biologically male or intersex, we'll get into that as well, can mean several different things. So let's start with chromosomes, right? So there is most of you probably remember if you took a biology class in high school or college, that humans have 23 sets of chromosomes, and those are numbered until you get to the sex chromosomes, which we have X's and Y's. Everybody's got X. Females typically are XX, and males typically are XY. So one could say that if somebody has a Y chromosome, that makes them male. But it's not quite as simple as that. So just because somebody has a gene, or an entire chromosome in this case, does not mean that that is being expressed. So if somebody does have a Y, we would call them genotypically male. So their genotype is male, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily being expressed. In the vast majority of cases, it is. But again, remember back to your biology class with Mendel and the peas and recessive and dominant genes. Well, there's recessive and dominant, so sometimes you can carry a gene and it just doesn't get expressed. But sometimes you can also have cases where the gene is broken, or for whatever environmental factors, it doesn't get turned on. So we have cases of individuals who have an X and a Y, but that Y is inactive, or at some point in their fetal development, the right sequence of events didn't happen, and so their body developed their phenotype is female. It developed as a female because in humans and other mammals, female is the default. So there's that. And then there's the cases where, in fact, it's not as simple as do you have an X or a Y, because sometimes some people have X, X, and Y, or any sort of combination of multiple copies of the same gene. So you could say that somebody is their genotype is biologically male with the presence of a Y chromosome. Doesn't mean that their body is going to act like a male body. Then we have anatomically male in biology. So that's going to be having the organs, or the version of the organs, because these organs all come from the same structures. They just differentiate during fetal development and then continue to do so further on in puberty and throughout life. But so if somebody has testicles and a penis, then we can talk about them as being biologically male. Now, it's not quite as simple as to say that a uterus and ovaries is female and penis and testicles are male, because there's a lot more going on when it comes down to the hormones. So we all have the same hormones, we just have different balances of those hormones, and the different sexes, the traits that we associate with one or the other are caused, one could say, or at least their development happens because of certain balance of those hormones. So one could give somebody who is female male more of the male hormones, or vice versa, and we would see development in their bodies according to that sex. So we have these two different ways that we can talk about biological sex. Now, so far, I've just talked about female and male, but it's not actually one or the other. Again, in the vast majority of the population, yes, but there are actually many, many people who are intersex. So they have some sort of combination or mix in terms of their physical features, in terms of their anatomy, between the different features that we would typically associate with one or the other. So that's sex. And again, it's more complicated than just what physical features we have. It also has to do with our biochemistry, and that's really important. Now we're finding out from a medical perspective, because it turns out that different sexes, or perhaps gender, this is a little tricky, we'll talk about that in a moment, may respond differently to different drugs. And we know that we respond differently depending on what hormones we have in our bodies at times. So from a sports perspective, a female and a male are not going to have the same hormones at the same time, and so how they respond to training and what type of muscle development they have going on, all kinds of things like that are going to be different based on the biology. So gender, on the other hand, although a related subject, gender is typically thought of now as a cultural phenomenon. Gender is the social expectations and expressions and values assigned to either the feminine, which would be girls and women, or the masculine, boys and men. Now, like I said before, until very recently, these things were seen as one and the same. And now we're starting to look at it and go, well, there's some nurture in here as well. We've got nature and nurture. But the tricky thing is that as humans, culture is so important. It's so integral to our existence. We are social primates, and all social primates have culture. But it's particularly important to us, and it shapes our entire way of seeing the world. So it's sometimes can be very, very to pull out what is instinct, what is happening because of biochemistry and what is happening because of our learned associations, our learned behaviors. And it's something that we don't have definite answers on right now. We, one can, on many things which are labeled one gender or the other, one can easily often find arguments for why that might be tied to a biological reason. There are other ones that can pretty clearly be said that's darn arbitrary. Different values that we might associate, like, um, so critical thinking, or gentleness, or passivity, or bravery, or, I can start naming these things, and I bet that you, as a member of this larger culture, automatically know where those words get assigned in terms of what gender they are. So, how much of that is social and how much of that is biological, um, we don't know yet. And it's really tricky to pull that apart, and it's not very easy to study that. It's especially difficult when we are trying to figure out the difference when we're studying it. Most of the studies in the past have not distinguished between female and woman. Those are lumped into one thing. So how do we pull apart if that was a trained, that was behavior, or a biological behavior? There's a really interesting book that I listened to recently. I don't remember the author's name, but it's called Delusions of Gender, so I'll put a link in there below. And the author talks a lot about the different studies which look at the differences and some of this so-called scientific evidence for the differences between the sexes and genders. And they really pull apart and look at the legitimacy and strength of those studies. So I think it's, if you're interested in the subject, it might be really fascinating to check that out, because it challenges a lot of assumptions. So, my opinion, and I'm just going to give my opinion and guess out there, is that the vast majority of what we assign to gender is arbitrary, is cultural, is something that we just have decided that that's the way it is, and it happened because of what the role of gender is or has been in the culture that we're coming out of. And that was a very agrarian, family centered, as in the family unit structure, in which having gender was a way of, or at least we used gender, because perhaps there is some legitimacy to gender in terms of it tied to instinct. I'm not sure, but I think there is, but to what degree? I think that the larger amount of gender, though, was based on a way of us separating out roles in society, and that it was just something that ended up happening from that. And we can get into more detail on that. But now we are moving. Society has been changing very, very rapidly over the last few hundred years, over just the last few generations. The way in which humans in Western society live has just completely changed. The way that we make our living, the activities that we do every single day, the technologies that we rely on, and the very structure in terms of what is the core unit of society has been shifting towards the individual and away from this family unit. And because of that, I don't think that gender as it was, in terms of separating out those rules, the rules isn't quite as important on that level. And that we are now beginning to value, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, this is just the values that we're having now, and I happen to, as a member of modern society, quite align with those values, starting to value the individual, valuing innovation and differences, because in those differences are where we're coming up with these new technologies and these new, that's what pays. right? The creativity is what pays, so that's what gets us the food. That's what makes us successful members of society and therefore successful within our species, because our species is a social species. Um, so there's a lot more freedom and encouragement to understand our social roles differently. And that's why I think that there's been a lot of change recently in gender expression. Now, when it comes to cis and trans and all of that, I suspect that those differences, those are probably neurological differences, so different neurotypes, which have probably always been there. But the way that they are able to be understood and expressed has changed given the context of the society that the individuals are living within. And I know that that almost sounds so simple that it shouldn't need saying, but I think that it does need saying in this context, that the way we view it, the way we view ourselves, changes based on the society that we're part of, which shapes who we are and what we see. So, what do I think about transgender people? I think they're people. Um, I think that I personally think that it is wonderful that we are moving, that we are in a time period where people can express that part of themselves and can start to live the way that feels, that matches the way they feel. I think we have a really long way to go still. We have a lot more work to do to make sure that we're living in a society that's more equal. And personally, I would love to see a society that doesn't focus so much on gendering things. Um, I'd like to see it not matter quite so much. Personally, I try to use the gender neutral pronouns when speaking about anybody who I do not know what their preferred pronoun is. Um, so, getting into the second question, which is talking about third gender, what our thoughts on that, and um, how would we react? It's something I'm a little hesitant on because I would be worried just that it might just be a codified another gender, right? Just another one that you fit into this box. And I don't particularly like those boxes very much in the context of today's society. I don't think we need those boxes on the same level. Um, and this is not to say that there shouldn't be different expressions of gender, that somebody shouldn't be able to be girly if that is what works for them, or be very manly, or whatever. I think that there should be the flexibility and the welcomeness of these different personalities and expressions, um, and that we shouldn't, that values and professions and things like that shouldn't be limited based on gender, is my take on that. And my worry with creating a third gender is that would just be another category, that people who are third gender are certain things are assigned, certain qualities, certain professions, they just be gendered, right? Okay, so I'm going to switch gears in this now and tie this back into paganism, because I know I spent a long time nerding out and just kind of sharing um, thoughts on gender and sex in general, but now I want to tie that to how does that relate to paganism? So, something I want to, there's some different frameworks that we can use to view the world. And one framework, which I think is by far the most common framework, is an anthropomorphic view of nature. One which, first of all, sees us perhaps as separate from nature, but understands nature within the context of, or anthropocentric, excuse me, within the context of humans. So we look at everything else and we assign traits, which are human traits, whether those are specific emotions or, in the case of what I'm going to talk about in this video, sex and gender. Now, there's also another way of viewing a different kind of framework, which is sort of the inverse of that. And I don't know what the correct term would be for that, but let's call it ecocentric, which sees humans within the context of nature instead of nature within the context of humans. So if we take a look at at nature from that perspective, and our understanding at trying to see ourselves within nature, see it as sacred, fit ourselves into the larger picture, then we can understand that sex is a very uncommon thing in nature. Now, that might sound really shocking when I say that, but if you think about it, the vast majority of life that is part of this planet does not have sex. As in, there's no male or female. In fact, does not even reproduce sexually. Now, this is the vast majority in terms of numbers of individuals, of species, but also in terms of the length of existence that they've had. Now, once we move into, we're just talking about living organisms here, right? Once we move into multicellular beings who do reproduce sexually, well, first of all, not all of them do, but there's a lot of different strategies. If we start looking at the fungal kingdom, well, they're not limited to two types of sexes, right? They've got all kinds of different strategies going on. And then we could look at plants, right? And so some plants, yes, the whole entire plant is a male or a female plant. But then in flowers, some of them have male and female parts, or some of them have flowers that are male and some of them flowers that are female. And asexual reproduction, very, very common in the plant world. We can look at amphibians and some types of fish that are able to simply change what sex they are depending on the environmental conditions, or types of worms that in fact are true hermaphrodites, which are both at the same time, they don't really need a male and a female to reproduce. But we see male and female as the normal because that is the scale that we exist on, and we are better able to see things that are similar to ourselves. But that's not what most of nature is like. And so we often take these ideas of male and female, which then bleeds into the way that we see masculine and feminine and these different associations that we've assigned to them, and then we assign that to the rest of the world, whether that's with a goddess and a god, or whether that's with the the masculine feminine energies, or whatever, this duality, which is a very common theme in many forms of modern paganism. I suggest that that is not a very accurate view of nature. But I'm not entirely sure where to go with that yet. This is a journey, this is a process. So for me, with my journey in paganism, I go, okay, well, how do I then bring that understanding back to my understanding and relationship with the world? How do I bring that back and understand my very special uniqueness and also incredible insignificance, and balance that? I'm not saying that other people who choose to view with that anthropocentric view are wrong. I'm just saying that for me, that does not, that's not where I'm going with my understanding. And that I think that there's an opportunity for much more, a deeper understanding and much more mysteries and depth to discover when we shift away from projecting ourselves onto everything else and seeing instead our us as a reflection, or how we weave into the pattern of it all. So I know this part is not quite as concise as before because it's still a place of I still have not found the words yet, so I do look forward to exploring this kind of concept more with all of you in the future. So let me see. I think that's going to be it. I know this week is a pretty big emotional week for a lot of people, no matter where one is on the many different spectrums involved. And I wanted to really emphasize that I do not mean any insult to anyone, and that I, like everyone else, am still learning, and I hope to learn more and to refine my understanding. And if I'm totally off somewhere, I hope to be able to see that, to be exposed to that, and to correct that. And I'm happy to be in today with this journey with all of you, and the journey that we as a society, whether we are pagans or Christians or whatever, that we are all going through together, and this incredible transformation and very complex, complicated crossroads that we seem to be at every step of the way. So until next week, have a wonderful week. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and take care.